Well, a happy Wednesday to you. I'm Clint Skutchan with T360. I'm going to be flying solo here today, although a lot to cover, and piggybacking for those that tuned in last week to our the NAR settlement implications for the industry with Jack and Ed Zorn from California Regional MLS. We'll be piggybacking a bit off of that here today. So as we wait for folks to come in, and for our live streaming capabilities here, we do want to say thank you for your time. Looking forward to it. Anticipate we'll go just a little beyond that 30 minutes that we initially had scheduled today, with a lot to cover. And I guess I would start by saying, the title of this one is To Concession Field or Not. But it's much bigger than that. When sharing with folks in terms of what we were going to be talking about here today, we really want to lean into the fact that what we're talking about here is an MLS related consideration, and it goes back to that session last week with Ed and Jack, where are we going to incentivize the new normal as the MLS industry, and in particular beyond that for the MLS industry? While it seems like it's just a field, we think that there is a significant competitive advantage to considering the idea of bringing forward the new normal for concession fields. And so going to outline that for you here today. Looking forward to it. If you do want to pop questions into the Q&A, we'll be monitoring that as well and doing my very best to get to those items as we get towards the end of the actual session itself. So do again, feel free to send those on. I'm going to jump in here, and we'll talk about those compensation models and what was the focus again of last week. And if you missed the webinar, which I'm referencing, if you go to our youtube.com/T360 page, you can subscribe there. You'll get all of our updated ones, but you can watch this full version from which I'm pulling some of these new and old ideas here. So we're going to start with that compensation model and how those are being viewed. Of course, the old model, as we're calling it, the broker sharing model, it has certain key elements that of course being that the listing broker and seller control the buyer's agent compensation, because it is shared and directed from one side of the transaction into the other. That of course has a lot of efficiency benefits, and we've realized those over the years, but has lent itself to some confusion for consumers. Ultimately, as we look at that old broker sharing model, really the idea of guaranteed compensation for brokers via the MLS, we know that is going the way of the dodo bird. That is going to, after August 17th, the timeframe in which has been stipulated for any our practice changes to be effective in the MLSs, that's going away no matter what. And so if that is to continue, it will be continued outside of the MLS, which brings with it some consideration and concerns, frankly, for those who I think have an MLS mindset if they've looked in on the NAR practitioner changes, that the idea of celebrating and talking about the need for commission sharing outside of the MLS still, I think, brings into question, whether or not that impacts the MLS's value proposition moving forward, and the complications and frankly some of the concerns I think it generates for consumers with these activities taking place outside of the MLS environment where there is monitoring and has been followed. So after August, there's going to be a separate negotiations that will be required for the actual buyer broken compensation, which is going to drive a lot of inefficiencies that the associations and the MLSs had provided before by having this inside of the MLS. You didn't have to pick up the phone and send out all those agreements and phone calls and time spent to try and figure that out and determine how to best split that model. So that's the old model. What was heavily focused on, and of course the encouragement coming from Jack and Ed, is to embrace this, and we believe that is true. And what can the MLSs do to facilitate the consumer-centric model, which is essentially made up of these key elements. The buyer broker sets their services and fees for the work with the buyer. They assign a direct agreement with them, and of course how that's actuated and implemented has other practice change considerations that we will save for another day, related to having various agreements in place with the buyer before showing and outlining what those service costs are. We'll set those aside for today. The listing broker themselves also set their services and fees to work with the seller. What that allows for is direct negotiations between the consumers themselves in order to actuate the sale of the home. That means that those offers and negotiations of all the various terms that are going to happen largely outside of the MLS and as a part of a negotiated process with the brokers, each in instance informing their clients. And so this is going to lead to why the concessions field becomes such a critical component for whether or not the consumer-centric model is adopted. And ultimately, all of those negotiations only matter so much as you get to a purchase agreement, which is going to govern not only the distribution of fees, but some of the other concessionary activities that are necessary to close these various types of transactions based on the consumers, the clients themselves, and their needs for financing. So that's the premise from which we're working here today. And how is the concessions field so central to this, and why are we bullish on the idea of implementing and actuating concessions fields? I want to go into that now and why we really want MLS decision makers and others to be thinking this through in a thorough fashion. So the old use case for the concessions field is one in which there are various key elements, just like there were key elements with what we just covered for the compensation. Ultimately, this has been coupled with procuring cause for commissions, and any use of the concessions field then has been predominantly documented post-closing. So really, this is something where there's confusion around the idea of what the concession field is today versus what it might become. And we're going to address that directly and actually have some industry-based best practices that we think should be considered by MLS practitioners to help consumers and actual brokers and agents better understand this new idea of what concessions field is. But ultimately, what that was a documentation of any financial incentives and other benefits, and this is important to note, offered by the seller and accepted by the buyer. This is the old use case. In other words, these were the things in a real estate transaction that enabled the buyer to complete the purchase. So that's our old use case. And this is further outlined if you go in and you look at RISO data dictionary related standardization of fields usage. And those concession fields in the RISO data dictionary, as currently constructed, are in the closing group. Those are data elements that really, again, are intended to describe facts that have occurred at the closing of the transaction, not just simply offers of potential financial agreements prior to close. Looking at some of the RISO data on that, their usage data shows that about 50% of the systems have concessions fields, these post-close concessions fields in them, and within 28% of the organization. So a fairly significant level of adoption for this old use case of the concessions field. And now this in the RISO data dictionary and in practice, it does include both a set field set and an open comments field set. This is important to note because this will become differentiated in terms of the new use case for the new concessions field that facilitates the consumer-centric model. The typical concessions, most already know and understand this, but I do want to point it out because it becomes important for the context of how we deploy the new concessions field, which is that it's largely included some sort of monetary amount, whether by dollars or percentages. So this has been the established practice. And of course, it's around closing costs, repair credits, prepaid expenses, interest rate buy downs. Any combination of those items is what the typical use case has been in the older concessions field. I want to move us now into what a new use case will be for the concession field, or fields plural in this instance, because we are bringing forward into the listing opportunity a new concession field, or as we will outline this coming up in just a moment, a offer field. So key elements here. The removal of procuring costs. Remember, we said after that August date, the idea that there are going to be commissions paid by simply entering it into the MLS go away. Any of those move outside of the MLS for consideration of offers and ultimately go into the actual agreements that are established. So Here, we're looking at that. So we take that as an important piece of this. This is an important piece from a risk and liability mitigation standpoint. And I know as we're talking to at the NAR event over the last few weeks and with the various systems providers out there about whether or not concessions fields will be adopted and utilized, the primary concern that we've heard is we don't want to take and replace commission concerns with concession field concerns. And so we don't want to inherit or onboard or bring forward any of those liabilities that have gotten us into this place moving forward. So it's important to note here with the removal of procuring of cause that those agreements and the offers are going to occur outside of the MLS environment. We'll come back around to that later on. But this is going to take a lot of the old use case post-close options and bring those forward. So the idea of documenting what actually has occurred will still be very important and a part of this process and one of the concessions fields, not just the only concessions field. What's important to know here under this new use case is that listing entry fields will now be brought forward into the listing application. In this instance, what this becomes is a marketing of the seller's initial willingness to consider offers from the buyer. So this is not a guarantee. This is not something that says because it's in there, this is what's going to transpire, but rather it's an indicator that we recognize, and in many instances, it will be driven by the likely buyer for the property as to whether or not the various incentives will be necessary and needed to get to closing. But this is going to indicate that, and it's going to be, again, any of those financial incentives or other benefits to enable the buyer to complete the purchase. So just a slight but a very important difference here in terms of how we present this concessions field versus the previously use case. In terms of the final pieces of this, it will primarily make use of a set of fields and an open numeric field. So a dollar amount or a percentage. And again, you don't have to use all of those pieces, but rather we will see folks choose to use certain elements depending on their level of comfort, whether or not they want to just say yes or no. There is an openness to concession conversations, or if they specifically want to include it and beyond a yes or no, what type of a numeric or an actual real dollar sense or a percentage basis might be used. So those are kind of the new use case. Again, the typical concessions, we don't anticipate that those will be significantly different now in terms of the categories, how they're used and how they're deployed in order to get to a successful transaction, depending on the various policy changes, financing-based changes will be different. But again, we do expect that at the end of the day, they are going to either have some sort of a monetary amount in there, whether they be dollar or percentage related. Those things will be retained. So very similar to the previous one. Interestingly enough, coming in the CRMLS environment, the California Regional MLS, they've already committed to taking actions against this. You heard Ed outlining last week from CRMLS is the part of that webinar, their approach to that. This is taken from CRMLS's infographic that they developed. So it helps us, I think, those who are looking at and trying to determine whether to concession field or not to concession field, why you might do this. And so these are the benefits that are outlined by CRMLS, and we tend to agree with these. When you look at the listing agents and sellers, they will gain a dedicated space to market the seller's willingness to consider concessions at the listing input level. From a buyer's agent standpoint, you can better serve those clients with that upfront info of which listings will then consider those concessions and assist with transaction-based fees. So again, largely believe that's a good thing. At the home buyer standpoint, and this becomes really important because remember, so much of what's gotten us to this point and the concerns and considerations have been the consumer choice, the consumer education, the consumer awareness. Here we believe, and is outlined here by CRMLS, that the home buyers will have an enhanced transparency around those listings which are willing to consider the concessions and assist with the financial as well as the actual needs of the property itself and any assessments that go along with that. So really great outline here, a good reference point if you are trying to yourself become educated as an MLS executive or to help your leaders understand what this looks like and why you might consider it. I think a very clear, concise message coming from CRMLS. These are some additional facts that they shared, and you heard Ed again sharing some of these in the broadcast last week, which was that they've been always in many instances, as we talked about, concessions have been recorded as a part of the closed status. CRMLS's own data says that 40% of the closed in 2023 had that. What's more importantly and impactful for this new use case of the concessions field, of those 40% that had the closing listing concessions, they also had about 15% that had some type of advertised remarks in the private remarks section. However, as we're moving forward and as we're already starting to see folks get creative with these concession remarks, there may be a need to be less open-ended in the remarks opportunities. And again, as we'll point out later, drive them towards these standardized fields that convey the intention or the openness to negotiating on these various concessionary-based opportunities. This again from those CRMLS infographic, this talks here about, the seller concessions are monetary payments. They may include costs of escrow, the lender's fee, loan discount points, repairs, inspections, buyer broker fees. Again, emphasizing here that a lot of those same things that have been a part of the lexicon, have been a part of the transactional process, will be retained with this new approach. The new price and concession field, that's what CRMLS is calling it, the SIP field, will be available for all listing types, but are not required. And how a buyer decides to use any of these concessions is really up to them entirely in their offers that they're going to bring. So again, a lot of optionality to this. Nobody is requiring or mandating or establishing industry type of practices that might draw concern in terms of it, impacting the consumers, or that there being an expectation or a absolute certainty to these. Further outlining how they're approaching it within CRMLS, and I think this becomes really important for us to think about, and this is where we talked about the new use case will not likely have open fields, but rather will have set fields, save for a concession and price, where they have it as a numeric field. So you can either use the toggling, which I'm hearing a lot of MLSs that are just simply wanting to say, are you open to this? Yes or no? And I think that's probably, if you wanted to dip your toe into the concessions field approach, that's probably the easiest and most clear and direct one that doesn't get you into any concerns around, the inclusion of any numeric items, whether that be from a dollar amount or a percentage standpoint. But remember, when removing procuring cause and the fact that the new use case for this concessions field is simply a marketed, not a guaranteed field, we still think that you're well within your bounds of being able to help streamline and to create efficiencies in the new consumer-centric model by including those elements. So the new use case for us really equals an opportunity for a new paradigm, this idea of the concessions field. And we need a new paradigm, because this is not while there are similar outputs and similar inclusions to the previous concessions field that was post-close, this pre-close, this during listing concessions field is going to set us up for a new paradigm, a new way of thinking, a new way of deploying this. Again, it's not guaranteed, it's not fact-based, it's marketed versus what has been accepted. And so we think that this becomes a new opportunity for that shift in the way we approach it and think about it as an industry, which then leads to the opportunity for a new listing field for MLSs. And right now, that's what a lot of folks are assessing, whether or not to include that new listing field. We think that this becomes really important for MLSs who are looking to retain their capacity as a true provider of pricing-based and closure-based intelligence for those that they serve, whether that be for the practitioners, the agents, the brokers, whether it be for some of those who are involved in the valuation model. We think this is actually going to become really great intelligence and important intelligence for advocacy-related activities of the association. As we try to demonstrate and show what the impacts of these practice changes mean for the actual consumer, there is a real opportunity here if you pair up the use of multiple concessions fields to be able to now demonstrate the real world impacts on various buyers in the marketplace. So this is really important in terms of creating a competitive advantage for the MLSs. I don't know why we keep jumping around here, but it just certainly does, and that's fun. All right. So, what we think is really important here and what I'm proposing today is that we bring forward a new descriptor, because as I've talked about, there's a lack of clarity between what the concessions field was in the old use case and the new use case. And so what I'm trying to do, and thank you again, there we go. Ta-da! The ultimate reveal here through technology. What I'm proposing and what we think is important is that as a part of setting a new paradigm, we have to change lexicon. And so what we're proposing is that rather than calling this new listing field a concessions field, you use it as a concessions field, but label it and term it as an open offer field. In other words, a way in which to market or convey that your seller is willing and open to accept open offers related to concessionary activities. So we are open to your offers as it relates to these things and conveying that fact. So why open offer versus concession field? We believe that by doing this, you can reduce some of the confusion of concessions as that old use case versus the new use case. And we'll ultimately believe that it's going to better communicate to practitioners and the consumers the purpose and intention of this as a marketed field. It is, as we've been delineating here, an initial willingness to consider offers versus a guarantee of or a threshold for acceptance of those. This is just simply saying we are open to it. And if you want to include the aspects of monetary, whether that be direct dollars or a percentage of cost, we think that at least helps to start the concessionary proceedings and to fulfill those offers in terms of filling them out initially if you're a buyer. Man, this is fun. All right. All right. We also think this is going to promote the MLS's adoption of these best practices. Again, as we're talking to not only the MLS systems providers and asking them, well, how many of your clients are asking for the concessions field? Or we're talking to the MLSs and saying, how many of you are actually considering the use of this field? What we're hearing is, again, that continued fear of the liability and risk moving from one field to the other by including this. And so as we go to the idea of conveying open offer, that is a different context than simply the concessions field because of the confusion that is retained there. So we think that they're ultimately behind this, not only bringing forward the adoption of new best practices more readily, again, helping to fuel that consumer-centric model by providing more upfront information to begin the actual negotiations. We think this is also going to then create greater clarity in reporting and delivery of that industrial intelligence that I noted before. This means that it's going to make us provide for us that opportunity to delineate what we mean by the marketed offer or the open offers that started as we're open to this versus what was the accepted offers or the actual concessions themselves. And we do think that the intelligence that's gained between that which is marketed versus that what is necessary to close deals, it becomes very, very important for a variety of your stakeholders. I guess the question, on the opposite, we said it at the beginning to open offer or not to open offer. And so again, why to open offer? We think this encourages that adoption of the consumer-centric model and upholds the spirit of greater consumer awareness. As was pointed out by Ed and of course Jack so well in their last webinar, was we actually think this new consumer-centric model is far more understandable and digestible for the consumers themselves. And consumer awareness and understanding is going to be the benefit of the industry should we be questioned moving forward. The idea that these things have been conveyed earlier on, that they were understood earlier on, not only by the practitioners who might direct or could again get into that sense of, is there perceived steering versus actual steering? That starts to diminish that when the consumers themselves can actually answer the question, who got paid, how, and why. We also think this is going to streamline and promote those negotiations. There is certainly, if you look at the beauty of our previously established model, there were significant efficiencies to that. It reduced the need for some of the different educational needs. It reduced some of the negotiation considerations. We think those are going to be heavily introduced in this, regardless of which model you use moving forward, as we pointed out. Even if you want to continue the idea of the old broker compensation sharing model, you're going to have to pick up the phone. You're going to have to find ways to communicate that. You're going to have to negotiate, talk that through. So if we're trying to move away from that model towards this one, if the MLS can promulgate efficiencies and expedite the ability to negotiate under this new consumer-centric model, we think that's a really beneficial thing for not only the practitioners, but for consumers. We also believe here that it might reduce those compliance demands and the liability risk. And the reason for that is you're going to end up monitoring, and we're already hearing this from MLS decision makers, that all sorts of folks are funneling all sorts of funny things, whether the open comments fields, whatever it might be, or the pillow on the couch with the 3% on it, or the microwave oven, whatever it is, all these creative ways of working around this. We think by giving them an outlet for these key negotiating terms, and by stipulating and having those very constrained and outlined and put into categorizations and ultimately standardized fields, we think that's going to focus those folks towards those rather than trying to use the open-ended comments. We also believe that it'll further establish and communicate the MLS's renewed competitive advantage. Look, the reality is with some of the elements that are included in this practices change, if those take root, those take hold, the old broker sharing compensation model takes root, and someone is able to solve for the practice changes and the concerns that led towards the litigative matters outside of the MLS while promulgating the idea of the shared commission structure, that could take the MLS from being the marketplace to a part of the marketplace. And so in order to retain the competitive advantage and the benefits that the MLS has offered, not only to practitioners but consumers, and I think we in the industry know those, can speak to those and talk about them eloquently. In order to retain that, we think by embracing the new consumer-centric model, that's going to allow us to retain that competitive advantage and discourage those off MLS commission sharing activities. And we know when that happens, that's going to promulgate the risk for the industry and further harm those consumers. The steering activities, the not knowing, all of those enforcement activities could be driven into an environment that we just don't think are to the benefit of anyone. So that would be one of those pieces to do it. And as we've outlined here, we think this is going to become proprietary market intelligence. This is, if you put this into the listing field and you have an open offer field as a part of your listing process, this is going to create an opportunity for that market intelligence to demonstrate. And something that we've learned through this conversation is in the comparisons to the Australian model was to say, oh, well, commissions in the US are much higher than there. But what we've learned in the last probably 6 months, many of us, is the fact that the total cost to close in those marketplaces, because of the cost considerations for marketing and doing all the things that are just inherent in our MLS system, are very cost prohibitive and expensive for the consumer. And so the total cost to sell or buy a home in those other marketplaces is different than the home's value. And I think this will allow us to start to tell that story of, yes, the home's value was this, but in order for the home to close, it took these financial incentives, it took these offsets, these items that to support the buyer in order to transact. And so that becomes proprietary intelligence, where the MLS has that upon the listing entry and the comparables of the open offer field with the closed concession field. What does that look like? And this adds value from back to the consumers. We can start to talk about, here's what this means for you if you're this type of a purchaser and you're going to require these types of incentives, and this is the housing marketplace that you're looking at. Here's what we believe to be the total cost, the considerations that you need to have in mind going into this, and you may have to adjust what the value of the home is that you're pursuing in order to fulfill what you can actually become financed on, and how can you pay to cover all the cost of purchasing the home, not just acquiring the home and its value itself. Again, this is really important. We think there will be value for appraisers and those who are doing evaluation. We think this is going to help brokers to inform and educate agents on how and when to negotiate in certain areas. And look, the reality is one thing that we know about this is because we've taken some of the efficiencies out and we've added more of the likelihood of the various negotiations having to occur and having to understand the totality of what it costs to close on a home and the different financial aspects and incentives that may be necessary. Agents are going to be stressed. They're going to be stressed and they're going to be challenged to really hone their negotiation skills. And so the more data that the brokers can provide back to their agents in that environment that come out of the MLS environment, that look at what was advertised, what was marketed in the open offers field versus what was ultimately accepted in the concessions field, becomes really important market intelligence and training opportunities for those brokers. By extension, it becomes an opportunity for associations to train on these new best practices. And for, again, those association-based advocacy issues, where I think, again, we're going to need to go back to the regulators. We're going to need to continue to demonstrate what these practice changes have meant in terms of real-world impact to consumers. If we have some of this data packaged and we're able to put it together, we think there's real value there for associations now to enhance their arguments when they're going and asking elected officials to address some of these changes. We heard today that the VA folks are going to allow for a temporary financing of those broker commissions. This might give us the data that we need to push that over the top in terms of it not just being temporary, but here's what we're seeing and why we believe it is really important that those are retained in an ongoing capacity. So we think these are the real rational reasons that go into putting into your MLS or considering the use of the open offer field, whether just as a simple yes, no toggle switch, but importantly, if you add those additional layers that get to the monetary aspects, we think there's real intelligence there. Why not consider adding the open offer field? Look, we get it, the fear of the unknown, that there could be some potential liability. That's, in a risk-averse environment, which most organizations that deal with MLS management operate from, we get it. We understand that's a part of it. But think about the fear of not embracing this and what it might cause, especially in a world where we know MLSs are becoming much more competitive with each other. If you sit back and you worry about that risk and you don't consider the risk of not doing it, that's something that we also believe has an impact. Ultimately, the concerns that the agent won't understand it and how it works, yes, we understand that might be something that holds you back, that you don't want to add confusion in an already confused marketplace. But again, doesn't this provide that opportunity to add value, to educate, to inform, to engage with folks more and retain them in the MLS environment rather than letting them continue these practices that they think they know off MLS? There is uncertainty over, vendors' ability to support your specific approach. I think some folks will take a different approach. Can they support it? But ultimately, in our conversations with the vendor partners, they've made it a commitment to fulfilling and helping their clients to get through this. And we think that, they've shown in the past the ability to iterate and move towards what will become standard and best practices. We imagine and expect that RESO and others will also come along with that to further standardizing those pieces. So those become aspects that are important. And then finally, the reason not to is, the old ways. That's the way we've always done it, which becomes a mentality that we hear a lot about in the organized real estate sector. It's something that often disappoints the brokers and the agents, and that we don't move forward. We don't look at the new opportunities that are in front of us. And I think with all the fear and the concerns and the what ifs and the risks and the liabilities around this, we do have to ask ourselves, what are the risks and the liabilities of retaining or enabling the old ways to continue? And we think those are significant. They're not only significant for our organizations, they're significant for practitioners, and they're significant for consumers. So we would rather look at the ways in which the opportunities come from these new doors, these new ways of thinking, and the new approaches that we can apply. So with that, we've hopefully presented a little bit of an understanding here of how the concessions field, while seemingly just a single field, has significant implications for the long-term competitive advantage of MLSs. And I really am talking with clients in the MLS environment about thinking through the idea of a competitive advantage versus simply having a value proposition. I'm hearing a lot of MLSs and saying, oh, we've got to double down and we've got to really get good at our value proposition. And while I don't disagree with the premise of that, the implications of having and continuing the idea of we've got to refine our value proposition presumes that you have a captured audience to begin with. And what we're saying is there may be more options, whether that be through direct competitions between the MLSs and the different ways they handle these practice changes themselves, or whether it's those who choose, or especially if a significant amount of folks choose to bring forward and keep the old ways and move outside of the MLS environment. That creates a level of competition we've never seen before. And that extends now into the association environment. And so by thinking about how are we creating competitive advantages, we think that's a slightly different mindset, because it doesn't presume that we haven't captured audience, that these subscribers who are subscribers today will be our subscribers tomorrow or our association members. And so we really are trying to move forward towards that idea of solidifying their competitive advantages. And ultimately, again, I think if we can provide real world, actual market-based intelligence, we can inform the regulatory conversations, which that, by the way, there, as I think we all know, there are more of those coming. We believe there are more of the litigative activities coming. So we have to not replicate what we did in the past, where we didn't clearly document, identify, and tell the story of our value proposition as an industry, as what MLS does and what we're facilitating. We think we've got to be really forward focused in our intentionalities here, and to learn from where maybe we didn't communicate those things in the past. So with that, I'm going to see if we have any questions that I can address here. I've got a question from Paul. Doesn't the difference between yes and no differentiate the listing to the point that the DOJ will see that as steering, and an agent might not show no listings to their clients? Look, we're already hearing, some of the folks out in the marketplace that, have changed the commissions that's being listed. And while many MLSs have had a number of those for a significant amount of time, I'm in northern Colorado, which is, a large marketplace, but it's not a ginormous marketplace. And I was out last weekend, and I heard from agents that were talking about those who are putting into the MLS different compensation structures than what they have typically seen in their marketplace, and how practitioners are responding to that. It's gonna happen, and the question becomes steering. Right. And again, it's an inherent understanding of whether there could be or whether there is steering activities going on. I think the reality is that we've got to tell a better story of it's not steering if it is simply a recognition of what it takes to be successful in what the marketplace is. Jack really was eloquent about this last week of saying, if we trust the consumers, if we trust in the marketplace, then to normalize and find its bearings, if we trust that, it's going to be demonstratable what the marketplace requires in order to succeed. And so again, while this may be walking the line a little bit between that steering conversation and just what it takes to be successful, I think we have to again start to tell the story of, if you don't offer compensation whatsoever, but the marketplace has deemed that the whatever the compensation rate is the norm in order to be able to be successful, I do think that we have to acknowledge that you can't just simply, because you don't want to pay for something, act outside of what the marketplace tells you you have to do in order to be successful. So I think this is some of the piece that I would point back to that conversation, Paul, of whether or not it's steering or not, the activities that occur, we've got to document and show that there is a real world implication to folks doing hard work, being rewarded for it, and ultimately the consumers that they're working with saying, it's important for us that the people we're working with get paid. I want them to be rewarded, because I not only just, out of the goodwill of my heart, but ultimately, when I pay someone to act on my behalf, I tend to believe they're going to do a better job than if they're doing it for free. If it's free, it's for me, is not my mentality, and I don't think it's the majority of folks, especially when it comes to something so is important, so core to their wealth, their value, in terms of what they can provide for their family, as is housing. So, but it's going to continue to be a point of contention. The other piece I would relate to that offering in the steering is, if we as an industry can't facilitate the adoption of this consumer-centric model, the idea of what's going to happen to the consumer in an environment outside of the MLS, where there has been a long-standing commitment to fiduciary and pieces that are broader in the marketplace than just simply their own pockets. Look, at the end of the day, MLSs have largely operated and acted like a natural monopoly. And I know people will gasp at that, but in reality, if you look back at the history of what a natural monopoly is, by definition, in the most instances, if not all instances, those have been allowed for in the marketplace because it actually was for the benefit of the greater good. And I think there's something that the organized real estate MLSs associations have demonstrated, is that at the end of the day, while we may have had some practices and things that weren't necessarily in the best interest of everyone, I think on whole, we've demonstrated that there has been a commitment to the greater good. Look, if this MLS environment was in a fully privatized environment, I can assure you that we would not be able to access, whether consumers, practitioners, or otherwise, all of this information at the price point that we have today. We wouldn't see the totality of the marketplace. I think there's plenty for us to defend ourselves and to act in the appropriate manner and tell that story moving forward, so that we can move away from that consideration of steering and telling the story of what it takes to fully actuate, close, and execute upon these new practices in a way that's healthy for not only the industry, but for the consumers themselves. Well, thanks. I know I've got a couple of other questions. I'll take those offline. Again, in terms of the specific practice changes, we really do encourage you to go look at the NAR resources for that. Otherwise, if you're wanting to talk further through the concession fields or the open offer fields approach, we are happy to visit with you about that. Again, this is more than just a field, and the change and the adoption of these consumer-centric practices mean more than just how our members and our subscribers are going to get paid, but ultimately we think it means a lot about as to whether or not we're going to create open, fair, and transparent marketplaces moving forward. Thanks for your time today. Appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you out there on the road at the next conference, or just by talking to you as clients. We value all of you and appreciate your feedback and your input. And while we've started the conversation here today, if you have ways to build upon this, or questions or concerns that can help us refine that, please reach out, let us know. Like all of you, we're doing our best thinking here, but we're all going to learn through this together moving forward. Have a great day.